Hello and welcome back, Biology 100 students. Today we're going to talk about the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a communication system which uses chemical messengers to regulate and control organs and glands. Now, like the nervous system, it does control things all throughout the body, but it does so much more slowly because these hormones have to travel from their source tissues to the target tissues. But it does interact with the nervous system in a couple different important ways, and we'll talk about those in this lecture. Okay, so a hormone is a chemical messenger or chemical substance secreted by our endocrine glands, and we call them endocrine glands because they are ductless. They do not have a duct leading to a body surface like an exocrine gland. So the chemicals secreted by endocrine glands are carried by the bloodstream to their specific target cells. And these tend to control a lot of slow, long-term body activities. For example, it controls puberty, and puberty is a process that takes years and years, as many of us know. It also controls things that go much more quickly. For example, a couple lectures ago we talked about the autonomic nervous system, and that dealt with the fight or flight or rest or digest sides. And the sympathetic response, that fight or flight response, is very, very quick. And in part, that involves some secretion of the hormone epinephrine coming from our adrenal glands. All right, hormones regulate a lot of processes in the body. For example, they regulate homeostasis of blood glucose. The hormones insulin and glucagon coming from the pancreas help to maintain the optimal level of blood sugar. They also maintain growth and development. We have a hormone, aptly called growth hormone, which helps to regulate body growth. And we also have hormones that regulate puberty and reproduction. Those would be hormones like estrogen and progesterone and testosterone. And finally, we also have hormones that regulate energy metabolism. When we think of thyroxine that comes from the thyroid, it sets your basal metabolic rate and basically controls the number of calories your body will metabolize in a day. And finally, believe it or not, hormones do actually affect your behavior. Think about the effects of testosterone on the adolescent male brain, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay, most hormones can be grouped into one or two chemical groups. They're either steroid hormones or they're non-steroid hormones. So steroid hormones are based on the molecule cholesterol, which you can see right there, and they have these 4 interconnected carbon rings. And because these are lipids, they are lipid soluble. They can go right through the cell membrane. And examples of steroid hormones include things like estrogen and testosterone. On the other hand, non-steroid hormones are usually synthesized from amino acids. They are not lipid soluble, so they have to bind to their target tissues in different ways, and they activate something called a second messenger. So examples of non-steroid hormones would be insulin. Insulin is a hormone secreted by the pancreas, which regulates blood glucose. Okay, here's an example of how a steroid hormone produced by one source tissue can affect its target cell. So on this side, you can see our source tissue that's producing steroid hormone. We'll say it's the testis or something like that. Now that steroid hormone's a lipid. It gets carried on the bloodstream by special carrier proteins. And then when it gets to its target tissue, it just goes bloop, right into the target tissue, right into the target cells, and then modifies what that cell is doing. It can go right through that cell membrane because the membrane itself is made up of phospholipids, and this was a lipid as well. And lipids dissolve other lipids very easily. Okay, now let's look at how a non-steroid hormone travels through the bloodstream. So here we have our source tissue. We'll say it's the pancreas, and the pancreas is secreting the amino acid hormone insulin. Insulin can travel through the bloodstream very easily because proteins and amino acids are soluble in water. And then when it gets to the target tissue, let's say a muscle cell, it can't actually go directly through that membrane because it's not soluble to protein. So that protein or amino acid will bind to a receptor on the outside of the membrane, and that receptor will release something called a second messenger on the inside of the membrane. And that second messenger will alter what that target tissue is doing in some way. It will alter transcription or translation of DNA. Okay, the composition of hormones also affects the way that we supplement these hormones if they're deficient in the body. Now, sometimes we take hormones for other reasons besides deficiency. Let's look right up here, and we have somebody taking a birth control pills. Birth control pills are mixtures of usually estrogen and progesterone, and these are steroid hormones. And because they're steroids, we can take them in a pill, and we absorb them very readily into the bloodstream. On the other hand, amino acid-based hormones like insulin can't usually be taken orally because once you swallow those amino acids would be denatured in the stomach before they're absorbed in the small intestine. So for these medications, we actually have to take injections, although we're working on oral forms at this point as well. All right, we're going to go through a brief overview of some of the endocrine glands in the body. They're already on your PowerPoint, so they're already labeled there. So if you have questions what things are, look at your PowerPoint file. But we're going to go through many of these organs in detail later on. So if we look up top there, we see the brain, and the brain has about 3 endocrine glands we want to talk about. One is the epithalamus. The epithalamus secretes the hormone melatonin, regulating day-night cycles. We also have the hypothalamus, which is sort of the god of the endocrine system. It controls the pituitary, and the pituitary controls a lot of these other glands down here. So the hypothalamus is very important, as is the pituitary. Next down, we have something called the thyroid gland, which is right there. The thyroid gland is right around your trachea there. It's your Adam's apple, and is important for a couple different reasons. Most importantly, it makes thyroxine, which is the hormone that sets your basal metabolic rate. So think about that. All right, next we have the pancreas right there. You probably are familiar with the functions of the pancreas. One of the things it does is secrete insulin and glucagon, and these are two antagonistic hormones that regulate the levels of glucose in your bloodstream. And finally, over here we have the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands secrete a suite of different hormones. They're located on top of the kidneys, and one of the hormones secreted by the adrenal glands would be epinephrine. Remember, epinephrine and norepinephrine are those sort of catecholamine hormones that help us deal with emergency situations, like fight or flight, stuff like that. Finally, down here, let's take a look at the gonads. In the female gonads, we would have our ovaries, and ovaries principally secrete the hormones progesterone and estrogen. Together, progesterone and estrogen regulate the female reproductive tract, they regulate puberty, and they also regulate the gestation of the fetus. And finally, down here we have the male reproductive glands, the testis, and the testis principally secretes testosterone. Testosterone is needed for spermatogenesis, for sperm production, but it also affects muscle build, it helps to break down fat, and it also affects the personality. Okay, let's take a closer look at some of the endocrine glands that we talked about in the brain. So here you can see the brain right here, and then we have that pineal gland, which we said will be secreting melatonin. And here's something called the hypothalamus, and then the pituitary gland. Again, the hypothalamus is sort of the boss of it all. Even though we call the pituitary gland the master gland, the hypothalamus is really in charge of the pituitary. All right, so the pituitary gland, it says here is the master gland, but just keep in mind that the hypothalamus is really the big boss that is in charge of the pituitary. The pituitary is divided into two lobes. We have an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe, and these are controlled by neurosecretory cells that are up here in the hypothalamus. These neurosecretory cells are unique because they have both a neuronal and also an endocrine function. All right, so this photo just shows a diagram of the connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary is controlled by nerve impulses from the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus sends nerve impulses and tells the posterior pituitary when to secrete its hormones. The hormones in the posterior pituitary were actually made up here in the hypothalamus, and they travel down this way. So the posterior pituitary doesn't really make any of its own hormones, but it does let those hormones go or secrete the hormones after it gets nerve impulses from the hypothalamus. Okay, so again, the posterior pituitary doesn't actually make hormones. It only stores hormones that are made in the hypothalamus. And these hormones are non-steroid hormones, and they include something called ADH and also oxytocin. Now, ADH stands for anti-diuretic hormone. Now, you've heard one of those words before, and that's diuretic. So a diuretic does what? It makes you pee. So what would an anti-diuretic do? Well, an anti-diuretic makes you not pee. And so this hormone is secreted by the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary, where it's released, and then it has effects on the kidneys and helps with water conservation. The second hormone here is oxytocin. Oxytocin is also a non-steroid hormone, and it has target tissues in the smooth muscle of the uterus and also the mammary glands. In the uterus, it helps to stimulate uterine contractions during childbirth, and in the mammary glands, it helps to stimulate the milk letdown reflex. So the big picture here is that both of these hormones are actually made in the hypothalamus but stored in the posterior pituitary. And they are released or secreted from the posterior pituitary when we receive nerve impulses from the hypothalamus. All right, now we're going to take a look at the connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. What you can notice first is that the neurosecretory cells are very much shorter in the hypothalamus here. They do not extend all the way down into the anterior pituitary. Instead, we have a capillary bed, little blood vessels that unite the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And what happens is the neurosecretory cells secrete these red things right here. Those little red dots are symbolizing what's called releasing hormones. So the hypothalamus secretes releasing hormones. The releasing hormones travel on the bloodstream down to the anterior pituitary, where there they stimulate the release of the actual anterior pituitary hormones, which are shown here in blue. So a big picture here is that the anterior pituitary does produce its own hormones, and release or secretion of those hormones is dictated or controlled by releasing hormones, which are released from the hypothalamus and travel to the anterior pituitary via the blood. Okay, the anterior pituitary makes 6 actual hormones, and these include growth hormone, which is important for growth. We're going to talk about that in just a second. It also secretes something called thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone, as the name implies, stimulates the thyroid, and it's going to stimulate the thyroid to secrete another hormone we'll talk about called thyroxine. Okay, we have other hormones as well, something called adrenocorticotropic hormone. This acts on the adrenal glands, on the adrenal cortex, and causes production of some stress hormones like cortisol, which we probably won't talk about in this lecture. And then we have gonadotropins. Now, gonadotropins means they're going to act on the gonads. So the gonadotropins here are FSH and LH, and those are secreted by the anterior pituitary, and they have effects on the gonads. They tell the gonads to secrete estrogen or progesterone or whatever they're secreting, and we'll talk about that more when we get to the reproductive system. And finally, the other hormone we have here is prolactin. Now, prolactin is a hormone that if you think about the name, you probably already know what it means. It means go milk. And so literally, prolactin stimulates the mammary tissue in the breast to produce milk so that we'll have nutrition for offspring. And finally, we have another hormone that we're not really going to talk about, something called melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH. That actually stimulates the melanocytes and can cause a darkening of the skin. Now, the big picture here is that the anterior pituitary makes and stores 6 different hormones, and that release of these hormones into the bloodstream is controlled by endocrine signals from the hypothalamus, and those endocrine signals are called releasing hormones. So if we want to put some growth hormone in the bloodstream, we're going to need a releasing hormone from our hypothalamus before we can do that. All right, so the first anterior pituitary hormone we're going to talk about in detail is something called growth hormone. And as the name implies, growth hormone regulates growth, but it also regulates other things as well. So the target tissues, the areas where growth hormone acts, are principally on the liver, but also the muscles and many other cells of the body. So within the liver, it stimulates release of something called IGF, or insulin-like growth factor, and together growth hormone and IGF stimulate amino acid uptake and protein synthesis throughout the body. It also stimulates cell growth as long as we're in our growing phase of our life. But once we reach a certain age, right, our epiphyseal growth plates will seal off, and so we're not able to grow any taller in height, but it's still an important hormone for repairing tissues and also maintaining blood glucose. The other thing that growth hormone does is affect or stimulate fat breakdown. Now think about what you were like when you were 15 or 18 or 20. Most of us were the skinniest we'll ever be at that age because we have these surges of growth hormone as well as testosterone or estrogen or things like that. And as we age, the ability of growth hormone to stimulate lipolysis or fat breakdown is reduced. And so I remember years ago, Sylvester Stallone got caught in Myanmar, and he got caught with vials and vials of growth hormone and also, I think, some testosterone or something like that. And basically, he was going there to film a Rambo movie, and he was like 65 at the time. And he said, hey, if you still want Rambo to look as ripped as he used to be, you have to have these hormones. Don't necessarily agree with that, but there is an age-related change in hormonal secretion as we get older. Okay, now that we've mentioned growth hormone, we're going to talk a little bit about some disorders that can go on with the pituitary gland or just hormone production in general. With most of these hormones, we can have either too much, which is called hypersecretion, or too little, which is called hyposecretion. So our example here is we're going to look at hypersecretion and hyposecretion of growth hormone and see what effects it has on the body. Okay, so hyposecretion, lower than normal secretion of growth hormone, can result in something called dwarfism. If we don't have enough growth hormone in the body, basically you grow very slowly, if at all, and so you have people that are short in stature and used to be called dwarfs. We don't say that anymore. But the point is this can be caused by a variety of things, one of which is a hyposecretion or lower than normal secretion of growth hormone. On the other hand, we can also have something called gigantism. Now, gigantism, as the name implies, results in really giant big people. Now, this can be caused by hypersecretion of growth hormone. We just keep secreting growth hormone and the epiphyseal plates never seal off. Now, this is usually caused by a tumor within the pituitary gland. And if left untreated, it usually leads to premature death. So even though it looks really cool that this guy's so tall, it probably has a lot of medical problems associated with that. Okay, now, on the other hand, acromegalic gigantism is a little bit different. This is a disorder that's caused when we have a tumor that forms after this person goes through puberty and reaches adolescence and stops growing. So at this point, the growth plates in the bones are already sealed up, so the extra growth hormone is not going to make us grow any taller in height, but what does happen is we get appositional bone growth. The bones grow wider and squarer. So this is the same person, and this is the person in their, let's say, teens or 20s. Take a look at the same person over here, and we're in our 40s, I would guess. And then by here, we're in our 60s or 70s. So what has changed? Well, you can see that her face looked very normal on this side, and then as she reached her 40s, we got the square jaw, sort of these protruding brow bone over here in the frontal bones. And then by the time she's in her 70s or whatever, you can see that her fingers are just huge. And so this is the effect of this hypersecretion of growth hormone, but it happens after they reach their normal height. Okay, now we're going to talk about the pancreas. Now the pancreas is both important for endocrine and exocrine function. For exocrine function, it makes different enzymes that are important in digestion. For endocrine, it makes two hormones that are called glucagon and insulin. And together these regulate the blood glucose levels. And these are antagonistic hormones. Glucagon causes a raise in blood sugar, whereas insulin causes a lower or decrease in blood sugar. All right, in order to understand how the pancreas maintains blood glucose homeostasis, we're going to take a look at a blood sugar curve of somebody after they've eaten a meal. So on the x-axis here we have time in hours, and on the y-axis we have the relative glucose concentration in the bloodstream. So let's say we start out at the normal 90 milligrams per deciliter. You don't need to know this number, but that is our normal set point level. That's what we're happiest at. Now what's going to happen to that number after we eat a big carbohydrate-rich meal like pasta? Well, it's probably going to go up, right? So that's what happens. We eat the meal, glucose levels go up like the curve showing right here. Now, if they continue to go up, eventually we're going to secrete some insulin. So insulin is important because it helps to bring our blood glucose levels back down. This is important for a couple reasons. One, if the blood glucose levels stay way too high for way too long, they can damage the retina and other tissues in the body. The other reason is we need this glucose in our tissues to fuel our cells. And so if it stays in the bloodstream, it's not doing us any good. So insulin helps to take that glucose out of the bloodstream and put it in the tissues where it's needed. So when insulin levels increase, blood glucose levels go down. All right, now let's assume your blood glucose is back to normal, but now you skipped lunch and the last meal you had was breakfast. So what's going to happen to your blood glucose levels? Well, they're probably eventually going to start to drop. Okay? And as they drop from 90 milligrams down to 60 or 50, you probably don't feel so well. You've had that feeling where you're a little jittery and you just are hypoglycemic. Some people actually get very angry, but it's a feeling that none of us really like. And so if our blood glucose levels go too low, we're going to have another hormone secreted called glucagon. And glucagon's job is to act on the liver and the muscles, and it pulls out glucose from those tissues and frees it up and puts it in the bloodstream. In actuality, it chops up a big molecule called glycogen, which is a storage form of carbohydrate, and that glycogen breakup results in glucose that's freed up for the bloodstream. So that brings us back to our set point. Remember, all of this is an example of negative feedback because it helps to reverse a change in controlled condition. We were at 90 and then somehow we got away from 90, and negative feedback always helps us to get back to our set point. So big picture here is insulin lowers blood sugar, glucagon raises blood sugar. So now we need to talk about an endocrine disorder called diabetes mellitus. And so this was a disorder that was initially described that people were urinating a lot, they were also very thirsty, and then when they tasted the urine, when we tested the urine, and that used to involve tasting, it tasted sweet because they had so much blood sugar in their blood that there was being lost in the urine as well. So first let's go back and look at a normal blood glucose curve. So this person eats a meal, normally they're at 90, but it goes up, but over the next couple hours it goes back down. Why is that? Well, insulin helped bring it down. But let's look at a diabetic. Diabetic eats the same meal, and their blood glucose levels go way up, 200, 300, sometimes even 400, and they stay up for a long period of time. So for whatever reason, they don't have enough insulin, or the insulin's not working properly, and so the blood glucose levels stay elevated for much longer than they should be. And if this happens day after day, week after week, it can result in death of some tissue within the kidneys and other areas of the body. It can result in circulatory problems. It can result in blindness, erectile dysfunction, all kinds of different types of things, neuropathy, unless it's treated properly. Okay, so there's two different types of diabetes mellitus. So we have type 1 and type 2. Type 1 results from not having enough insulin. We simply have hyposecretion of insulin, and so what we do there is we just give them insulin. Not a big deal. This is usually juvenile onset. You usually develop this early on. Type 2 is late onset, or called adult onset diabetes. For whatever reason, your body becomes insensitive to insulin. We have special receptors on the cells, but those receptors stop responding to insulin as much as they normally would. And so this is usually managed by exercise and diet. So type 2 happens for us lazy couch potatoes that aren't getting enough exercise, that are eating the wrong kinds of foods, but there's also a genetic component as well. Okay, now we're going to shift gears and move back to one of the endocrine glands we talked about in the brain, and that was the pineal gland. The pineal gland secretes the hormone melatonin. Now, melatonin is responsible for regulating our circadian rhythms. That is your wake and sleep cycles. And so when the melatonin levels rise, you tend to get sleepy, and when they go back down, you tend to wake up. And so this is set partially based on our light levels that are around us, you know, the daylight, night, things like that. But sometimes if you travel to a different time zone, your circadian rhythm gets out of whack and you're waking up at 3 a.m. and feeling really sleepy at 6 or 7 p.m. And so again, pineal gland helps to regulate our circadian rhythms. Okay, now we're going to talk about the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland has a couple different endocrine functions. One is it regulates the calcium levels. It secretes something called calcitonin, which helps to regulate the calcium levels in the bloodstream and in the bone. And it also regulates our basal metabolic rate through the hormone called thyroxine. Thyroxine, or T4, increases our basal metabolic rate. And so some people have high metabolisms, high levels of thyroxine, and they tend not to put on weight as easily as other people, especially if you get older. So calcitonin, we said before, lowers blood calcium, puts that calcium back in the bone, whereas parathyroid hormone actually raises blood level calcium. And we talked about that in a previous chapter. Just be aware that the thyroid and the parathyroid are different organs. The thyroid is what we see right here. The parathyroids are 4 little glands on the back of the thyroid gland. So big picture here is that the thyroid secretes calcitonin, which regulates calcium levels, and it also secretes thyroxine, which sets our basal metabolic rate. One thing we also need to mention is the thyroid gland requires iodine in order to make thyroxine. So what happens if we're not getting enough iodine in the diet? Well, this might happen, something called goiter. Goiter is caused by a lack of iodine in the diet. And so the thyroid gland needs iodine as well as something called thyroglobulin in order to make the functional thyroid hormone, or thyroxine. So if it's trying to put together this functional thyroxine, all it has is the thyroglobulin. So it starts to accumulate it and accumulate it and accumulate it, and it can't release it because it doesn't have any iodine. So we get this very large enlarged thyroid gland if we don't have any iodine in the diet. And that's why if you look at most salt at the grocery stores, it says iodized salt. So we started iodizing table salt a long time ago because we realized that some areas of the country didn't get enough iodine in their diet, and so this is a very simple way to supplement iodine. Okay, now we're going to talk about a disorder of the thyroid gland called Graves' disease. Now, Graves' disease is caused by hypersecretion of thyroid hormone, or thyroxine. And remember, thyroxine principally regulates our metabolic rate. So you might think, oh, that's great, right? A higher metabolism, I could eat more things that I want to eat without getting fat. That is true, but there's also a lot of downsides as well. So first of all, you get these protruding eyes, and that's not very attractive, right? It's hard to go on Snapchat or Tinder and get a date there. It also causes hyperactivity, listlessness. It also causes this tachycardia, which is an increased heart rate. So it makes you pretty darn miserable, and most people that have advanced Graves' disease need to be treated by an endocrinologist. Okay, now we're going to look at the adrenal glands and talk about the hormones they produce. So the adrenal glands are these little fatty glands that are on top of the kidney, and the adrenal glands are divided into 2 parts. We have a cortex, which is on the outside here, and then the medulla, which is on the inside. So the cortex produces a hormone called cortisol. Okay, cortisol from the cortex, that makes sense. Cortisol is a hormone that regulates blood glucose levels. It helps to raise blood glucose when we're stressed. And it also is important in downplaying or sort of reducing the effects of the immune system. So we have drugs that mimic cortisol, things like prednisone or hydrocortisone, which we use to stamp down or eliminate inflammation. So a lot of corticosteroids will reduce inflammation, but they have a lot of downsides as well. All right, another hormone produced by the cortex is called aldosterone, and aldosterone regulates the minerals, principally sodium, in the bloodstream. And then we have something called epinephrine, norepinephrine. These are 2 hormones that are produced here in our adrenal medulla, and these are your fight or flight hormones, right? So if you're barreling down the road in your car and all of a sudden a deer runs in front of you, or I don't know, a pig here. So a pig runs out in front of you in the middle of the night and you screech on your brakes and you think you're going to run off the road, but you don't. You get this huge dose of epinephrine, which causes the dilation of the pupils, it causes the heart rate to go up, it causes your respiration to go up, it causes your air passages to dilate, all getting you ready for that emergency situation. All right, last but not least, we're going to talk about hormones produced by the gonads. Now, the gonads, if you didn't know, are the ovaries and testes. So the male gonads are testes, the female gonads are ovaries. So ovaries produce 2 hormones that we need to talk about, estrogen and progesterone. Now, both of these are steroid hormones, and estrogen is important for a lot of reasons. One, it establishes the female secondary sex characteristics where we get fat deposition on the buttocks and thighs, breast enlargement, that kind of thing. It also regulates the female puberty cycle. Progesterone, on the other hand, helps to get us ready for gestation, progestation. So it's getting ready for possible implantation of an embryo and to gestate that embryo. So progesterone primarily has effects on the uterus. Okay, the testes are the male gonads, and just like the ovaries, they produce hormones, and the hormone produced by the testes is testosterone. So testosterone is another one of those steroid hormones, and it has effects on stimulating or regulating spermatogenesis, sperm production, but it also has effects on other tissues of the body. For example, in males, testosterone affects the brain for sure, and it also affects the metabolic rate to some degree. It stimulates lipolysis. So think about your little brother when he was like 8 or 10, he's a little bit pudgy, and all of a sudden when he starts going through puberty, they start shedding this weight very, very quickly because testosterone stimulates lipolysis or fat breakdown. And so it has effects elsewhere in the body too. Just like estrogen, it can stimulate body hair production, and it also stimulates behavioral changes as well. All right, you've reached the end of the lecture on the endocrine system. As always, if you have any questions that you don't understand, go back and review that part of the lecture again. If you still have questions, send me an email or text, and I'll get back to you right away.